Have you ever been blamed for everything, even when you were the only one telling the truth? Stay with me until the very end, because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about the day an entire family realized they had spent years condemning the wrong person. I still remember the sound of the glass shattering before everyone turned to look at me. No one asked what happened. No one cared. My father simply pointed at me and said, "Of course it was you." That wasn't the first time I had been blamed, and it wouldn't be the last. My name is Kafilwe Zubayn. I'm 29 years old, and I restore historic buildings across South Africa. Every day, I repair old places that people believe are beyond saving. The strange thing is, I became good at rebuilding broken things because my own family spent years breaking me. In our home, I wasn't a son. I was the black sheep. My older brother Sunil Dlamini was the successful one. My mother Nalwazim Thethwa proudly introduced him to everyone while pretending I barely existed. Every family gathering ended the same way, with me carrying blame for mistakes I never made. For years I stayed silent. Then my grandmother died. And one sealed file changed everything. That I wish I could tell you there was one big mistake that made my family stop trusting me. But the truth is much worse. I became the person they blamed for everything, even when I had done nothing wrong. If money disappeared from the house, everyone looked at me first. If one of my father's business plans failed, somehow it became my fault. Even arguments between relatives ended with someone saying, "Kafilwe always brings problems into this family." After hearing those words for years, I almost started believing them myself. The strange part was that nobody ever asked for proof. They didn't care about facts. They already had someone to blame, and that someone was me. It became so normal that whenever something bad happened, I could see my parents turning toward me before anyone even explained what had happened. My older brother, Sunil, never had to defend himself. He was always called hardworking, responsible, and successful. Even when his own mistakes caused trouble, our parents found excuses for him. They said he was under pressure, that everyone makes mistakes, or that people were simply jealous of him. Family birthdays were supposed to bring everyone together, but I dreaded every invitation. While Sunil received expensive gifts, long speeches, and endless compliments, I usually became the target of jokes. My uncles laughed about how I would never become successful. My aunts compared me to my brother and asked why I couldn't be more like him. Every holiday dinner felt less like a celebration and more like another trial where I was already guilty before anyone spoke. The only person who treated me differently was my grandmother. Whenever everyone else walked away, she quietly sat beside me and reminded me that the truth never disappears, even when people refuse to see it. She always told me that lies can survive for years, but they can never survive forever. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. I thought she was simply trying to comfort me after another painful family gathering. A few weeks before she passed away, she held my hand and looked at every member of the family with unusual seriousness. Then she made one final request. She told us that after her death, every immediate family member had to be present when her personal documents were opened. Nobody understood why she insisted on it. Most of my relatives assumed it was just another discussion about inheritance. None of us realized that her final wish would uncover the truth that had been hidden for decades and change our family forever. The day of my grandmother's funeral should have been a day to remember the woman who held our family together. Instead, it felt like people had gathered for a business meeting. As I stood beside her coffin, I expected to hear stories about her kindness, her wisdom, and the sacrifices she made for everyone. But that wasn't what I heard. Small groups of relatives stood in corners whispering to each other. They weren't talking about her life. They were talking about her house, her savings, her land, and who would receive the most valuable things she left behind. Every conversation sounded the same. Someone asked how much her property was worth. Someone else wondered if she had hidden money that nobody knew about. I looked around the room, hoping at least one person truly missed her. Instead, greed had already replaced grief. It hurt because my grandmother deserved so much better than this. My parents barely looked at me the entire day. When guests came to offer condolences, they stood proudly beside Sunil, introducing him as if he were the only son who mattered. I stood just a few steps away, yet it felt like I was invisible. No one invited me into their conversations. No one asked how I was feeling after losing the only person in the family who had always believed in me. Sunil, however, looked unusually confident. He walked around greeting relatives with a smile that seemed out of place at a funeral. I noticed him quietly telling a few family members that grandmother had always been proud of him. From the way he spoke, it sounded like he had already convinced himself that he would inherit everything she owned. Some relatives even congratulated him before any documents had been opened, as though the decision had already been made. As the funeral service came to an end, the family attorney slowly walked to the front. The room became quiet as everyone turned toward him. He offered his condolences, then removed a sealed document from his briefcase. His voice was calm, but his words immediately caught everyone's attention. He explained that my grandmother had left behind very specific written instructions. According to her final wishes, none of her personal documents, letters, or legal papers could be opened until every immediate family member was present in the same room. The whispers immediately returned. Some people looked confused while others looked impatient. My parents exchanged nervous glances for the first time that day. Sunil frowned, clearly expecting everything to be settled immediately. I didn't know why my grandmother had made such an unusual request, but something inside me told me this wasn't simply about inheritance. It felt as though she had spent years preparing for one final moment, and whatever was hidden inside those sealed documents was powerful enough to make sure every single member of our family witnessed the truth together. A few days after the funeral, every member of the family arrived at the attorney's office. The atmosphere was completely different from the funeral. Instead of sadness, there was excitement. Everyone believed this would be a simple inheritance meeting where property and money would be divided. My uncles quietly discussed which house might be sold first. My aunts whispered about jewelry and family valuables. Sunil walked in with the confidence of someone who believed he already knew the outcome. My parents sat beside him with smiles that they tried to hide, as if they were certain my grandmother had rewarded their favorite son. I quietly took a seat near the back of the room. No one spoke to me. That was nothing new. I simply waited for the meeting to begin, expecting to hear my name only if someone wanted to blame me for something again. The attorney greeted everyone politely before placing several files on the large wooden table. He carefully checked that every immediate family member was present, exactly as my grandmother had requested. Then, without saying another word, he reached into his briefcase and slowly removed one large sealed envelope. Everyone watched closely. The attorney looked directly at me and said, "This envelope is addressed only to Kafilwi Zubain. According to your grandmother's written instructions, it must be opened before anything else." For a moment, the room became completely still. Then my mother immediately stood up. "There must be some mistake," she said quickly. "Why would she leave something only for him before the rest of the family?" My father agreed just as fast. He insisted that the attorney had probably mixed up the documents. Sunil folded his arms and laughed softly, convinced the envelope couldn't possibly contain anything important. Even some relatives nodded, believing my parents were right. The attorney remained calm. He held up my grandmother's signed instructions and explained that there was no mistake. Her directions were perfectly clear. The envelope belonged to me, and it had to be opened in front of everyone before any inheritance discussion could continue. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside wasn't money or a will. There were dozens of handwritten letters tied together with ribbon. Thick family journals filled with careful notes. Old financial records organized by year. Bank statements. Receipts. Signed documents. Even faded photographs that looked older than I was. The attorney began placing each item on the table one by one. Every new document made the room quieter. The first letter mentioned events from years ago that everyone believed they already understood. The photographs showed moments that told a completely different story. The financial records didn't match the version of history my parents had repeated for decades. No one interrupted anymore. The whispers disappeared. One by one, every confident smile faded. As the evidence continued to pile up on the table, everyone slowly realized that my grandmother hadn't left behind an ordinary inheritance. She had left behind the truth. The attorney picked up one of the oldest files and carefully opened it. He explained that my grandmother had organized every document by date so nobody could question the order of events. The first file took us back nearly 10 years, to the time when I had been accepted into one of the best restoration training programs in South Africa. I remembered that day clearly because it was one of the happiest moments of my life. I had worked hard, earned excellent results, and dreamed of building a career restoring historic buildings. But only a few weeks later, everything suddenly fell apart. My parents had told everyone that I wasted my chance. They said I had become lazy, refused to continue my education, and threw away the money they had saved for me. For years, that story followed me everywhere. Relatives repeated it at every family gathering. Whenever someone asked why I never finished my studies, my parents would shake their heads and say, "Kafil destroyed his own future." After hearing the same lie for so many years, even people outside the family believed it. Then the attorney placed several bank statements on the table. He pointed to one transaction that had been made just days before my tuition payment was due. The amount matched my entire education fund. Instead of being sent to my college, the money had been transferred into another account belonging to one of Sunil's struggling businesses. The room became silent. The next document explained everything. Years ago, Sunil had secretly made a series of terrible business decisions. His company was drowning in debt, and creditors were demanding immediate payment. My parents panicked. Instead of allowing him to face the consequences of his own choices, they quietly emptied the savings account that had been created for my education. They used every cent to rescue him without telling anyone. But that wasn't the worst part. To make sure nobody discovered what they had done, they created a different story. They told relatives that I had lost interest in studying. They claimed I refused to attend college and wasted the opportunity they had worked so hard to give me. Little by little, the lie spread through the entire family until it became accepted as the truth. No one ever questioned it because everyone trusted my parents. The attorney then opened one of my grandmother's handwritten journals. Inside, she described the exact day she learned what had happened. She had confronted my parents after noticing the missing money. She even wrote down their response. They admitted they had saved Sunil because they believed he had a brighter future, while I would find another way. As those words were read aloud, I couldn't even look at my parents. For years, they had blamed me for destroying my own dreams. They watched relatives criticize me, mock me, and call me a failure without saying a single word to defend me. The painful story everyone believed had never been my failure at all. It was their betrayal. After the truth about my education fund was revealed, nobody in the room spoke for several moments. My relatives looked down at the documents spread across the table, unsure of what to say next. But my grandmother hadn't finished telling her story. The attorney quietly reached for another journal and opened it. He explained that every file connected to another, and together they revealed a pattern that had lasted almost my entire life. The first pages described my childhood. Suddenly, memories I had tried to forget began making sense. I remembered being promised a bicycle for my 12th birthday. My parents told me they couldn't afford it because money was tight. A week later, Sunil proudly rode home on a brand new motorcycle that my parents had helped him buy. Back then, I believed it was simply bad timing. Now, receipts inside the file showed they had chosen to spend my birthday savings on him instead. The attorney continued reading. There was another record about a scholarship I had earned during high school. I remembered how excited I had been when the acceptance letter arrived. Then, without warning, I was told the scholarship had been canceled because important documents were never submitted. For years, I blamed myself for missing the opportunity. But my grandmother had kept copies of every letter. One handwritten note revealed that my parents had deliberately ignored the paperwork because Sunil needed financial support at the same time. Once again, my future had been quietly sacrificed to protect his. More documents appeared. There were receipts for birthday gifts that had supposedly been bought for me, but were later given to Sunil. There were letters explaining family holidays that were canceled because of financial problems, even though bank records showed thousands had been spent paying Sunil's debts only days earlier. There were written records of family arguments where I had been blamed for creating tension, while private notes proved I wasn't even involved. One by one, every painful memory found its real explanation. The room felt heavier with every page. I looked around and noticed my relatives no longer staring at me with disappointment. Instead, they were looking at my parents. My uncle, who had spent years calling me irresponsible, slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his face. My aunt covered her mouth as she reread one of the letters. A cousin who used to laugh at me couldn't even meet my eyes anymore. No one needed to argue. The evidence spoke louder than anyone could. The image my family had built for years was falling apart right in front of them. I had never been the careless younger son who wasted every opportunity. That person had only existed in the stories my parents told to protect Sunil. Every lie they repeated had become another brick in the false picture they created of me. And now, with every document my grandmother had saved, those bricks were finally beginning to crumble. Just when everyone thought the biggest secret had already been revealed, the attorney slowly closed one file and reached for another locked box that had been sitting beside his chair the entire time. He paused for a moment before speaking. "I have one final collection of documents," he said quietly. "Your grandmother instructed me to open this only after the family understood the truth about the missing education fund." Everyone leaned forward. The attorney unlocked the box and carefully removed several thick journals. Their covers were worn with age, and each one had a year written neatly on the front. There were almost 20 of them. He explained that my grandmother had spent nearly 2 decades writing down everything she witnessed inside our family. Every financial transaction that seemed unusual. Every family argument. Every promise that was broken. Every false accusation made against me. Whenever something happened that didn't feel right, she quietly recorded it with dates, signatures, receipts, and supporting documents. The room became completely silent. She had known that one day people might question the truth. She also knew that memories fade and stories change. That was why she never relied on memory alone. She collected proof. The attorney opened one journal and began reading. Inside were detailed conversations between my parents about money they believed nobody else had heard. Another page contained signed copies of financial papers that matched the bank records already spread across the table. There were receipts carefully attached beside handwritten notes explaining exactly why each payment had been made and who had truly benefited from it. Then came something I never expected. The journals didn't only expose what my parents had done. They also revealed what I had quietly done for them. Years ago, when my father was struggling to pay important bills, I had accepted extra restoration jobs during weekends and secretly contributed money to help the family. I never asked for recognition because I believed families should help each other. According to my grandmother's notes, my parents accepted my support without telling anyone where the money came from. Another journal described how I turned down a better-paying job in another city because my mother had asked me to stay close to home after my father became ill. She promised the family would finally appreciate my sacrifice. That appreciation never came. Instead, I continued being called selfish and irresponsible. The journals also revealed that I had paid for repairs on the family home after a severe storm. While everyone publicly thanked Sunil for taking care of the expenses, I had remained silent because I didn't want my parents to feel embarrassed. Page after page showed the same heartbreaking pattern. Whenever I made a sacrifice, someone else received the credit. Whenever something went wrong, I received the blame. I looked around the room and saw tears in the eyes of relatives who had judged me for years. They finally understood that the person they had called the family's biggest disappointment had spent most of his life quietly protecting the very people who never stopped accusing him. My grandmother had known the truth all along. She had simply been waiting for the day when nobody could deny it anymore. After the attorney finished reading the final journal, the room was completely silent. No one argued anymore. No one searched for excuses. The truth had become too clear to ignore. For years, everyone believed I had chosen to stay away from the family because I was cold, proud, and difficult. But now they finally understood that I hadn't walked away from them. I had slowly been pushed away, one painful moment at a time. The attorney closed the journal and quietly said something that stayed with everyone in the room. People are not born as the black sheep of a family. Sometimes they are made into one. Those words hit everyone differently. Suddenly, old memories looked completely different. My relatives remembered family dinners where I stayed silent while everyone laughed together. They had always believed I was being rude. Now they realized I had simply grown tired of defending myself against accusations that never stopped. They remembered birthdays where I sat alone after being blamed for arguments I didn't start. They remembered holidays where I left early without saying goodbye. Back then they called me disrespectful. Now they understood I had only been trying to protect myself from more pain. For years, every insult, every unfair comparison, and every false accusation slowly built the lonely person they later criticized. They called me distant without asking who had pushed me away. They called me quiet without wondering how many times my voice had been ignored. One by one, my relatives began speaking. My oldest uncle slowly stood up and looked directly at me. His voice shook as he admitted that he had judged me for years without ever asking for my side of the story. He said he had simply believed everything my parents told him. Then my aunt wiped tears from her eyes and apologized for comparing me to Sunil every time we met. She confessed that she now realized she had helped spread lies that were never true. Even cousins who had laughed at me during family gatherings quietly admitted they had copied the opinions of the older family members because they thought those stories had to be true. No one apologized because I demanded it. No one apologized because they wanted something from me. They apologized because the evidence left them with no other choice. I looked toward my parents hoping they would finally say something. But they remained completely silent. They couldn't deny the journals. They couldn't argue with the receipts, the letters, or the signed documents. For the first time in my life, they had no story left to hide behind. At that moment, I finally understood something my grandmother had been trying to teach me for years. I had never been born as the family's black sheep. That image had been created little by little, through years of lies repeated so often that everyone accepted them as the truth. And now, after all those years, the truth had finally done what I could never do alone. It had spoken for me. Just when everyone believed there could not possibly be any more surprises, the attorney gently folded my grandmother's journals and reached for the very last folder on the table. He smiled softly and said, "Everything we have discussed so far explains the past. This final document is about the future." Everyone watched closely. My relatives assumed this was finally the part where the inheritance would be divided equally. Some even picked up their pens, ready to sign whatever papers were placed in front of them. Sunil leaned back in his chair with confidence, still believing he would receive the largest share despite everything that had just been revealed. The attorney slowly opened the final document and began reading my grandmother's last instructions. Her words were simple but powerful. She wrote that money could always be earned again, but trust, honesty, and character were much harder to find. Because of that, she had made one final decision that reflected not who talked the most, but who had spent a lifetime proving himself through actions. The attorney looked directly at me. He announced that my grandmother was leaving me the responsibility of managing the family's entire historic property portfolio. It included several old buildings, heritage homes, and valuable properties that had been in our family for generations. Instead of selling them for quick money, she wanted them restored and protected for future generations. The room filled with shocked expressions. Several relatives looked at each other in disbelief. My parents stared at the attorney without saying a word. Sunil's confident smile disappeared almost instantly. The attorney continued reading. In her letter, my grandmother explained exactly why she had made this decision. She wrote that while everyone else had focused on appearances, status, and money, I had quietly built a career restoring forgotten buildings that other people considered worthless. I had dedicated my life to preserving history instead of chasing attention. She believed that someone who respected old buildings would also respect the family's true legacy. Then the attorney handed me one final sealed letter written in my grandmother's own handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Her words felt as though she were sitting beside me one last time. She wrote, "My dear Kafilwi, people spent many years trying to damage your reputation. They believed that if enough people repeated the same lie, it would become your identity. But never forget this. Reputation depends on what others say about you. Character depends on what you choose to become. Character always outlives reputation." By the time I reached the end of the letter, tears filled my eyes. For the first time in many years, someone had seen me exactly as I truly was. My grandmother had not given me the greatest inheritance because I was her favorite. She gave it to me because she believed I would protect it with honesty, patience, and integrity. At that moment, I realized her greatest gift was never the properties themselves. It was her complete faith in the person I had become despite everything my family had done to break me. When the attorney finished reading my grandmother's final letter, nobody rushed to speak. The room that had once been filled with confidence, whispers, and expectations had become painfully quiet. Every person sitting there was forced to face something they had avoided for years. They were no longer looking at me as the family's problem. They were looking at themselves. For the first time, my parents had no explanation. They couldn't blame missing documents. They couldn't say people had misunderstood them. Every lie had been supported by years of evidence, signed papers, receipts, journals, and letters written by the one person who had quietly watched everything happen. My father lowered his head and stared at the table. The man who had always spoken with confidence couldn't find a single word. My mother wiped tears from her face, but no amount of crying could erase what everyone had just learned. They had spent years protecting one son while destroying the other. The silence was finally broken by Sunil. He slowly stood up and looked around the room. His voice was shaking in a way I had never heard before. "I need to tell the truth," he said. Everyone turned toward him. He admitted that over the years he had accepted every advantage my parents gave him without asking questions. Whenever they paid his debts, rescued another failed business, or bought him something expensive, he simply accepted it. He never stopped to ask where the money came from or who had quietly paid the price. He confessed that he had enjoyed being treated as the successful son because it made his life easier. Then he looked directly at me. "I should have asked questions," he said quietly. "I should have protected you instead of enjoying the attention." His words didn't erase the past, but they were the first honest thing I had ever heard from him. Around the room, relationships began falling apart. Some relatives confronted my parents for lying to them for so many years. Others admitted they had unfairly judged me without ever listening to my side of the story. Old arguments started again, but this time nobody blamed me. The family wasn't breaking apart because of me. It was breaking under the weight of its own lies. As everyone argued, I quietly gathered my grandmother's letter and placed it back inside its envelope. I realized something important. For years I had imagined this moment. I thought that if the truth ever came out, I would finally feel satisfied. I imagined shouting at everyone, reminding them of every insult, every accusation, and every painful memory they had forced me to carry. But standing there, I felt none of that. I didn't want revenge. Revenge would only keep me trapped inside the same pain they had created. Without saying another word, I thanked the attorney for protecting my grandmother's wishes. Then I calmly walked toward the door. No one tried to stop me. As I stepped outside into the fresh air, I realized my grandmother had never fought to prove that I was better than my family. She had fought to make sure I was free from them. And I refused to let bitterness steal the future she had worked so hard to give me. Several months passed after the meeting in the attorney's office, and my life slowly became peaceful in a way I had never experienced before. For the first time, I woke up every morning without worrying about what my family was saying behind my back. I no longer felt the need to defend myself because the truth had already done that for me. Instead of focusing on the painful past, I focused on the responsibility my grandmother had trusted me with. That I began restoring every historic property she had left under my care. Some of the buildings had been abandoned for years. Their walls were cracked, their windows were broken, and many people believed they were beyond saving. But every time I walked through those old buildings, I saw something familiar. People had looked at me the same way. As the evidence continued to pile up on the table, everyone slowly realized that my grandmother hadn't left behind an ordinary inheritance. She had left behind the truth. The attorney picked up one of the oldest files and carefully opened it. He explained that my grandmother had organized every document by date so nobody could question the order of events. The first file took us back nearly 10 years, to the time when I had been accepted into one of the best restoration training programs in South Africa. I remembered that day clearly because it was one of the happiest moments of my life. I had worked hard, earned excellent results, and dreamed of building a career restoring historic buildings. But only a few weeks later, everything suddenly fell apart. My parents had told everyone that I wasted my chance. They said I had become lazy, refused to continue my education, and threw away the money they had saved for me. For years, that story followed me everywhere. Relatives repeated it at every family gathering. Whenever someone asked why I never finished my studies, my parents would shake their heads and say, "Kafil destroyed his own future." After hearing the same lie for so many years, even people outside the family believed it. Then the attorney placed several bank statements on the table. He pointed to one transaction that had been made just days before my tuition payment was due. The amount matched my entire education fund. Instead of being sent to my college, the money had been transferred into another account belonging to one of Sunil's struggling businesses. The room became silent. The next document explained everything. Years ago, Sunil had secretly made a series of terrible business decisions. His company was drowning in debt, and creditors were demanding immediate payment. My parents panicked. Instead of allowing him to face the consequences of his own choices, they quietly emptied the savings account that had been created for my education. They used every cent to rescue him without telling anyone. But that wasn't the worst part. To make sure nobody discovered what they had done, they created a different story. They told relatives that I had lost interest in studying. They claimed I refused to attend college and wasted the opportunity they had worked so hard to give me. Little by little, the lie spread through the entire family until it became accepted as the truth. No one ever questioned it because everyone trusted my parents. The attorney then opened one of my grandmother's handwritten journals. Inside, she described the exact day she learned what had happened. She had confronted my parents after noticing the missing money. She even wrote down their response. They admitted they had saved Sunil because they believed he had a brighter future, while I would find another way. As those words were read aloud, I couldn't even look at my parents. For years, they had blamed me for destroying my own dreams. They watched relatives criticize me, mock me, and call me a failure without saying a single word to defend me. The painful story everyone believed had never been my failure at all. It was their betrayal. After the truth about my education fund was revealed, nobody in the room spoke for several moments. My relatives looked down at the documents spread across the table, unsure of what to say next. But my grandmother hadn't finished telling her story. The attorney quietly reached for another journal and opened it. He explained that every file connected to another, and together they revealed a pattern that had lasted almost my entire life. The first pages described my childhood. Suddenly, memories I had tried to forget began making sense. I remembered being promised a bicycle for my 12th birthday. My parents told me they couldn't afford it because money was tight. A week later, Sunil proudly rode home on a brand new motorcycle that my parents had helped him buy. Back then, I believed it was simply bad timing.